The air in the library was thick with the weight of unspoken words. It clung to the leather-bound spines of 10,000 books and settled like dust on the polished mahogany of the great table. 3 men in dark suits sat on one side, their faces a mixture of fatigue and frustration. On the other side sat Mr. Tanaka, a man whose quiet stillness seemed to absorb all the sound in the room. He was a billionaire, a titan of industry, but at this moment, he looked more like a disappointed scholar. He had been speaking for 10 minutes, his voice a low, steady murmur in a language the other men did not understand. It was a deliberate act, a wall built of syllables, and the men on the other side were left to stare at its impenetrable surface. Mr. Davies, the lead negotiator, shifted in his chair, the squeak of leather a vulgar interruption in the hallowed silence. He glanced at his colleagues, a shared look of impotent anger passing between them. They were being dismissed, rendered irrelevant by a language they could not decipher. In the far corner of the room, almost lost in the long shadows cast by the afternoon sun, a woman in a dark blue uniform polished a silver picture frame. Her movements were small and efficient, designed to make her invisible. Her name was Sarah, and her entire existence within these walls was predicated on her ability to see and hear nothing. Beside her, a splash of pale pink against the dark wood, stood her daughter. Lila was 9 years old, a small, serious child with eyes that seemed to see everything. She was not supposed to be here, but the after-school program had closed early, and Sarah had no other choice. Lila stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back, a silent promise to her mother that she would be as unobtrusive as the dust motes dancing in the sunbeams. Mr. Tanaka paused. His gaze lifted from the table, sweeping past the tense faces of the businessmen, past the towering shelves of silent stories, and for a fraction of a second, it landed on the little girl in the corner. It was a glance so brief it was almost imaginary, but in that fleeting moment, the stillness in his eyes was replaced by a flicker of something else. A question. A curiosity. Then it was gone, and he resumed speaking, his voice once again a calm, impenetrable river of sound, leaving the others stranded on the shore. Their apartment was 3 small rooms tucked away on a street where the sirens were a constant lullaby. It smelled of lemon-scented cleaner and the fried onions her mother, Sarah, cooked for dinner. The contrast with Mr. Tanaka's mansion was a chasm Lila crossed every day. The mansion was a world of hushed carpets, of light that filtered through stained glass windows like liquid gold, of a silence so profound you could hear the whisper of a turning page from across a hall. Their apartment was a world of worn linoleum, of a single bare bulb that hummed a weary tune, of the constant noise of a life lived in close quarters with 100 others. Yet it was home. It was the place where Sarah would soak her tired feet in a basin of hot water, her face etched with a weariness that Lila felt in her own small bones. It was also the place where Lila's greatest treasures lived. They were not toys or dolls, but books. Discarded books from the mansion's library, volumes with slightly torn covers or pages that had come loose from their binding. To Mr. Tanaka, they were refuse. To Lila, they were entire worlds. Sarah would bring them home in her tote bag, a secret offering for her quiet daughter. "Another one for your collection," she would whisper, placing it in Lila's hands like a sacred artifact. Lila would spend her evenings at their small kitchen table, the book propped open, her small finger tracing the lines of text. She was a collector of words, of sentences, of the shapes of letters from languages she had never heard spoken aloud. She would move her lips silently, tasting the cadence of a paragraph, imagining the voice of the person who had written it centuries ago. Her mother watched her, a knot of pride and worry in her chest. She saw the fierce intelligence in her daughter's eyes, the quiet determination. She worked her fingers to the bone, breathing in the scent of other people's wealth, scrubbing away their footprints, all for this small, serious girl who found her joy not in the playground, but in the silent company of forgotten stories and unspoken languages. On a quiet Tuesday, the mansion was still. The usual flurry of business associates and household staff was absent, leaving behind an echoing peace. Sarah had been tasked with dusting the upper shelves of the library, a meticulous job that required focus and a steady hand. Lila, having finished her homework, was allowed to sit in a small armchair in the corner, a rare privilege granted on such slow days. She was reading one of her treasured discards, a thin volume of poetry. The air was warm and smelled of old paper and beeswax. Mr. Tanaka was there, seated in his large leather chair by the fireplace, a book resting in his lap. He was not the formidable businessman today, he was just a man reading. The silence stretched, comfortable and unbroken, for nearly an hour. Then Mr. Tanaka sighed, a soft, weary sound. He looked out the tall window towards the gardens, his eyes distant. He murmured a line of verse aloud, his voice barely a whisper, a thread of sound woven into the quiet. It was a lament, a beautiful, melancholic phrase. From her corner, Lila looked up from her own book. The words he had spoken were familiar to her. She had read them just last night, tracing their elegant forms with her finger. Without thinking, without considering the consequences, she whispered the next line. Her voice was as soft as a moth's wing, almost imperceptible. The moon follows the same path, but the traveler is lost. The effect was immediate. Mr. Tanaka froze. The book in his lap slipped slightly. He did not turn his head. He simply sat, utterly still, as if a sudden movement might shatter the moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted his gaze, and his eyes found the small girl in the pink dress. Lila's heart hammered against her ribs. The spell was broken. She had spoken. She had made a sound in this house of silence. She looked down at her book, her face burning, wishing she could shrink and disappear into its pages. Sarah, perched precariously on the library ladder, heard the whisper and saw the look on Mr. Tanaka's face. She scrambled down, her own heart seizing with panic. "Sir, I am so sorry," she said, rushing to Lila's side. She didn't mean to disturb you. Please forgive her." She put a trembling hand on Lila's shoulder. Mr. Tanaka's expression remained unreadable. He looked from the terrified mother to the small, silent child, and then back again. He said nothing. After a long, heavy moment, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, and returned his attention to his book. But he did not turn the page for a very long time. The scene replayed in Lila's mind, the memory of it sharp and clear. She was once again standing in the corner of the great library, her mother's hand a warm, cautionary weight on her shoulder. The tension from the negotiating table radiated outwards in waves, and Lila felt it like a physical pressure. Mr. Davies was a man who filled a room with his voice, with his expansive gestures, with the sheer force of his condescending presence. He treated Mr. Tanaka not as an equal, but as a provincial curiosity, a man with an exotic but ultimately irrelevant set of customs. When Mr. Tanaka switched to his native tongue, it was a shield, a final defense against the other man's abrasive disrespect. Mr. Davies, excluded and irritated, leaned towards his aide. His whisper was a venomous hiss that cut through the room's strained quiet. "What is he saying now?" "Probably complaining about the tea." Lila flinched. The words were a casual cruelty, a dismissal not just of a man, but of a whole world of meaning. She understood every syllable Mr. Tanaka spoke. He was not complaining. He was speaking of heritage, of the promises made by his grandfather when the company was just a small workshop. He was explaining that a contract was not merely a piece of paper to be signed and litigated. It was a reflection of one's name, one's history, one's soul. The beauty and precision of his words stood in stark contrast to the ugliness of Mr. Davies' sneer. A fire ignited in Lila's chest. A fierce, protective urge to speak, to correct the gross injustice of the moment. She wanted to shout that they were wrong, that they were deaf to the poetry and the honor in his speech. Her lips parted, but then her mother's fingers tightened on her shoulder. The pressure was a clear command. Stay small, stay silent, stay invisible. Sarah's face was a mask of anxiety. She had seen men like Mr. Davies before, men who could crush a person's livelihood with a careless word. Her fear was a tangible thing, a cage of love and protection that kept Lila's own voice locked inside. So Lila remained silent, the unspoken truth burning on her tongue, a silent witness to a conversation where only one side was truly listening. A few days passed. The mansion hummed with a renewed sense of purpose. Another delegation had arrived, this one more respectful, more attuned to the nuances of their host's culture. Mr. Tanaka had employed a professional translator, a polished woman with a crisp accent and an impressive vocabulary. Yet, something was still being lost. During a discussion about a proposed partnership, Mr. Tanaka used a specific term, an idiom that spoke of two rivers merging to form a greater one. The translator, competent but literal, rendered it as a joint venture for mutual benefit. The poetry was gone. The spirit of the idea, of two distinct entities creating something new and more powerful without losing their original identity, was flattened into sterile corporate jargon. Mr. Tanaka's brow furrowed. He tried to rephrase, to explain the philosophy behind the image, but the cultural chasm remained. The delegation nodded politely, but they did not truly understand the depth of the commitment he was offering. Lila was not meant to be listening. She was in the grand hallway, waiting for her mother to finish her duties for the day, a book of fairy tales open on her lap. But the heavy oak doors to the meeting room were slightly ajar, and the voices drifted out. She heard the repeated phrase. She heard Mr. Tanaka's quiet frustration, and she understood the missing piece. On a small mahogany side table near the door, a notepad and a gold-plated pen had been left behind. An idea sparked. Moving with a quiet swiftness that was second nature to her, she crept to the table. Her small hand took the heavy pen, and on the clean white paper, she drew a single, elegant character. It was not a word, but a concept, the symbol for a confluence, where waters meet and mingle but are not consumed. It was the heart of what he was trying to say. She left the notepad on the table, face up, and retreated to her corner, her heart thumping. Later, as the guests were being shown out, Mr. Tanaka's senior aide paused, his eyes catching the strange marking on the notepad. He picked it up, puzzled, and showed it to his employer. Mr. Tanaka stopped. He took the small sheet of paper and stared at the character drawn in a child's unsteady but certain hand. A slow, deep understanding dawned in his eyes. He looked up, his gaze sweeping the now empty hallway, searching for the ghost who had left him the message. The atmosphere in the conference room was glacial. A crucial document, the final addendum to the agreement, had arrived, but its text was dense with legal and cultural idioms that defied simple translation. The official translator, their only linguistic bridge, was caught in a citywide traffic jam, his arrival uncertain. Minutes stretched into an hour. Patience, already a finite resource, was evaporating. Mr. Davies, who had been invited back for this final signing, was pacing, his expensive shoes squeaking on the polished floor. "This is absurd," he announced to the room at large. "Can't we just use an app? A machine? How important can the exact phrasing be?" "It's a standard liability clause." His dismissiveness was a lit match in a room filled with fumes. Mr. Tanaka sat at the head of the table, his face a mask of carved granite. His silence was more damning than any outburst. The entire deal, months of work, teetered on this single point of understanding. His associates exchanged worried glances. Sarah was in the room, a silent specter, refilling water glasses with a trembling hand. She wanted to be anywhere else. Lila stood by the door, a small, forgotten piece of furniture. She was supposed to be waiting in the kitchen, but the palpable tension had drawn her out, a moth to a flame. Mr. Tanaka's gaze swept the room one last time, the impatient Americans, his own anxious team, the maid trying to disappear into the wallpaper. And then his eyes found Lila. They held her for a long, deliberate moment. It was a risk, a wild, improbable gamble. He made his decision. He straightened his shoulders and spoke, not to the men at the table, but to the room itself. His voice was not loud, but it commanded absolute attention. He spoke in his own language, a clear, resonant question. "Is there anyone here who understands the weight of a promise?" Silence descended. The Americans looked bewildered. Mr. Davies let out a short, derisive snort. It was a rhetorical question, a piece of philosophical nonsense. And then, a voice, small but clear as a bell, cut through the stillness. A promise is heavier than a mountain. Every head in the room turned. There, by the towering bookshelves, stood Lila. She was perched atop a stack of thick encyclopedias she had dragged from a lower shelf, a makeshift podium that raised her just high enough to be seen. Her hands were clasped behind her back, her small face serious. She was looking directly at Mr. Tanaka and only at him. The room froze. Sarah's hand flew to her mouth, a silent gasp of pure terror escaping her lips. Mr. Davies's smirk dissolved, replaced by an expression of slack-jawed disbelief. For the first time, in that vast and opulent house, the maid's daughter was no longer invisible. She was the center of everything. The silence that followed Lila's words was absolute. It was a silence filled with shock, with confusion, with the dawning of an impossible new reality. Mr. Tanaka's face remained an unreadable mask, but his eyes, dark and intense, were locked on the small girl. He saw no fear in her, only a quiet, solemn certainty. The world seemed to shrink until it contained only the two of them, the powerful billionaire and the 9-year-old girl on her throne of books. He continued the exchange, his voice low and steady, still in his native tongue, a private conversation held in a public space. And what happens when it is broken? The question was for her alone. Lila did not hesitate. The words came to her as if she were reading them from a page she had known her entire life. Her voice, though small, carried the weight of the ancient proverb it held. The mountain falls, and everyone beneath it is crushed. The metaphor was perfect. It was the very heart of the contractual clause they had been debating, the idea of catastrophic shared consequence. It was not about liability, it was about interconnected fate. The simplicity and profundity of her answer hung in the air, a truth so clear it was breathtaking. A slow, almost imperceptible change occurred in Mr. Tanaka's posture. The rigid tension in his shoulders eased. He rose from his chair and walked, not to the negotiating table, but towards the corner of the room. He stopped before the stack of books and looked down at the child who had just articulated his entire business philosophy in 2 short sentences. He did not smile. He did not offer praise. He simply acknowledged her with his full and undivided attention. Then, he turned to face the stunned audience. He looked at his own team and announced, his voice calm and authoritative, "The translator has arrived." He paused, his gaze shifting to Lila. "This child has explained it perfectly. The nuance is integrity. Something a machine cannot translate." His eyes finally moved to Mr. Davies, and they were as cold and hard as polished stone. "And something some men cannot comprehend." The dismissal was final, a clean, sharp cut that severed the frayed cord of their business relationship. The deal would proceed, but not with him. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of quiet, controlled chaos. Mr. Tanaka's team moved with renewed purpose, ushering the stunned and humiliated American delegation out of the room. Mr. Davies shot a look of pure venom toward Sarah as he passed, a look that promised retribution. Once the room was cleared of everyone but household staff, he made good on his threat. He cornered Sarah by the service pantry, his voice a low, furious snarl. "What kind of trick was that? Did you teach her a few phrases to impress him? A cheap party trick to get a bonus?" He loomed over her, his anger a suffocating presence. Sarah, pale and trembling, could only stammer, "No, sir. My daughter, she just reads a lot." "I don't know how. You don't know?" Mr. Davies sneered, his disbelief thick with contempt. "This is a setup. The maid and her clever little girl, trying to get something from him." "It's pathetic." He spun on his heel and marched directly to Mr. Tanaka's senior aide, a severe, impeccably dressed man named Mr. Ito. "You need to tell him," Davies insisted, his voice regaining its bluster. "It's a performance. It has to be. The woman is manipulating him." Mr. Ito, a man for whom loyalty and protocol were everything, was now placed in an impossible position. The accusation was insulting, But Mr. Davies was still a powerful man, and the appearance of impropriety had to be addressed. With a heavy heart, he approached his employer. Mr. Tanaka had requested to see Lila and Sarah in his private study, a room even senior staff rarely entered. Mr. Ito intercepted them at the door. He bowed deeply. "Sir, with my deepest apologies," he began, his voice strained. "Mr. Davies has made an accusation. He suggests this knowledge might be a rehearsed performance. He believes the mother is using the child. The challenge was laid bare. Was this a miracle of intellect, or a carefully crafted deception?" The weight of proof now rested entirely on the small shoulders of the girl in the pink dress. The study was even more impressive than the library. Books lined every wall from floor to ceiling, not just in shelves, but in towering, precarious stacks. The air smelled of aged leather and ink. A large globe stood in one corner, and intricate maps were framed on the walls. It was a room that belonged to a scholar, a traveler, an explorer of worlds both real and imagined. Mr. Tanaka sat behind a large, uncluttered desk. He gestured for Sarah and Lila to sit in the two chairs opposite him. Sarah perched on the very edge of her seat, her hands twisting the fabric of her apron, her eyes darting nervously around the room. Lila sat quietly, her feet not quite touching the floor, her gaze fixed on the man behind the desk. Mr. Ito waited discreetly outside the closed doors. Mr. Tanaka did not begin with an interrogation. He did not ask Lila where she had learned his language or how she knew the proverbs. His approach was far more subtle and far more telling. He rose from his desk and walked to a glass-fronted cabinet. From it, he retrieved a very old, very fragile-looking book bound in dark, cracked leather. The characters on the spine were faded with age. It was not a common text, not something a child could find in a discard pile or study from an app. He returned to his desk, laying the ancient volume down with reverence. He opened it carefully, the dry pages whispering in the silent room. He turned them until he found what he was looking for, then rotated the book to face Lila. He pointed to a verse, a dense block of complex, archaic characters. He did not ask her to read it aloud. He did not ask for a translation. He asked a question that went far deeper. Speaking in his native tongue, his voice soft, he asked, "What does the poet feel here?" It was a test of soul, not of syntax. A test of empathy, of true comprehension. Lila leaned forward, her brow furrowed in concentration. She studied the elegant, unfamiliar script. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy. Sarah held her breath. For a full minute, Lila said nothing. Then, she looked up from the page, her clear, honest eyes meeting Mr. Tanaka's. "He feels lost," she said, her voice a soft murmur. "Like a boat with no anchor, watching the land drift away. He is not sad. He is empty." The word she chose for empty was a rare, poetic one, implying a hollowing out, a profound spiritual void. Mr. Tanaka closed the book. The soft thud of the leather cover echoed in the quiet room. He gave a single, slow, deliberate nod. The proof was absolute. It was an understanding so deep, so intuitive, it could never be faked. A long moment of silence passed. Mr. Tanaka looked from the book to Lila, and then his gaze settled on Sarah. The intensity in his eyes softened, replaced by something that looked like respect, perhaps even compassion. "Your daughter has a gift," he said, switching back to English so Sarah could understand. His voice was quiet, but it held the weight of a verdict. A mind that sees beyond words on a page. She understands their heart. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled before him. "When I was a boy," he continued, his voice taking on a distant, reflective tone, "I grew up in a small village. There was no library. The only book in my house was one my father had carried with him from the war. Education was a luxury we could not afford. I see that same hunger for it in her eyes. The hunger I once had." Sarah listened, tears welling in her eyes, her fear finally giving way to a wave of overwhelming emotion. This powerful, intimidating man was not angry. He understood. He saw her daughter, truly saw her, in a way no one else ever had. Mr. Tanaka leaned forward again. I will not offer you money, he said, his gaze direct and serious. Money is temporary. It can be spent or lost. I will offer her something far more valuable. I will establish an educational trust in her name. It will fund her entire education from this day forward. Any school, any university in the world she chooses when the time comes. All she must do is continue to learn. To feed that hunger, the words hung in the air, a promise of a future Sarah had never dared to dream of. She covered her mouth with her hand, a sob catching in her throat. All the years of aching backs and chapped hands, of swallowing her pride, of feeling invisible, it had all been worth it. It had led to this moment, to this impossible gift for her child. Lila, however, did not cry or gasp. She simply absorbed the magnitude of the offer with her usual quiet composure. She slipped off her chair, stood before the desk, and gave Mr. Tanaka a small, formal bow, an act of respect she had learned from the very books that had brought her here. The final image was one of profound peace. Later that evening, the hierarchy of the house was gone. Lila was not standing on a stack of books to be seen. She was sitting in the large armchair opposite Mr. Tanaka, the ancient book of poetry resting on a small table between them. Would you read to me? He had asked. And so she did. Her small, clear voice filled the grand study, breathing life into the words of the long-lost poet, her language flowing as easily as a river finding its way home. They were no longer a billionaire and a maid's daughter. They were two minds from two different worlds, connected by the timeless, universal language of stories.